The way through the darkness had been long, and even with the help of his phone to orient himself, it had been difficult pinpointing where exactly he had to go. After all, this was all still completely unknown terrain to James. The call with the matriarch had gone quiet a while ago, and he wondered just what she was planning. One of the last things I'm still wondering is what exactly you want from me, and why me specifically, was the last thing he had asked her. However, she had put on a very worrying undertone as she had answered,
"Oh, well that is mostly your own fault. You may have been a prime candidate, but you weren't irreplaceable in any way. However, now it turned out you are in too deep already. By now you're a liability, I'm afraid. As to the why, you will find out soon enough. Either way, I hope you forgive me, but I have to attend to something real quick. I'm a busy woman, as you know, but I do hope we can continue this little chat later."
And before he could respond with anything, she had hung up. That had been quite a while ago, giving him plenty of time to think through her implications. The message was quite clear. By now, if he wasn't with them, he was most certainly against them. And he probably wouldn't want to find out what happened with people who were against them, although chances were that he had a pretty good idea. Given that they had by now arrived in the general area he had aimed for, James turned on the flashlight of his phone, illuminating the dark space and hurting his eyes for a moment, as they had gotten used to the near absolute darkness. Behind him, he could also hear Conglorge let out a pained hiss. "Sorry about that," James quickly mumbled, while shining the light around the barren floor. Finally being able to see, Conglorge let his eyes independently scan the room curiously.
"This place is quite fascinating,"
he commented, while tilting his large head left to right to take in as much information as possible.
"How did you find out about it?"
James didn't pay much attention to it, still looking around the floor and walls, filled with all sorts of cables, as he distractedly answered, "Well, the matriarch herself showed me the private bullet train. I just figured that they'd need to get maintenance done on the thing somehow, and finding the entrance wasn't that hard, given the typical communal design." As if that was his cue, he finally managed to find the slight indentation in the wall that he had been looking for this whole time. Quickly he walked over to it, and pressed his ear against the wall, intently listening for anything that may be happening on its other side. He couldn't hear anything. Given that that was his best bet, he got to work opening the concealed hatch belonging to the door. "Let's hope they're not onto us yet," he mused with a sly smile, and put in the code. 53719. And he let out a relieved breath as the seal on the door released. He really had been lucky, that this entire hidden railway was apparently based on the same system, and used the same password. Of course, unlike the massive entrance, the flimsy maintenance hatches would have offered no real resistance had he wanted to break through them, but he much preferred this more elegant approach. It also helped with staying undetected for ever so slightly longer, given that he was leaving no traces anywhere. At first he was going to comment on the laughably low security level, but given the fact that it was such an unimportant subsystem, he probably shouldn't have expected anything else. Although it was a bit strange that the elite of the elite didn't demand a higher standard for themselves, or maybe that was the human in him talking. The hatch opened into the dark tunnel housing the rails of the bullet train used for the elite's personal transportation needs. The faint light of the nearby station softly shone through the open doorway and slightly illuminated the immaculate white walls. James sniffed the air. It was stale and stagnant, which should mean that there was currently no train moving through the tunnels anywhere near their position. Better that way. He really wasn't in the market for getting run over right now. Suddenly he was cast in shadow, as Conglorge's massive frame appeared above him, as the giant reached his massive head into the tunnel, looking around as well. "The coast seems to be clear," James said, stepping away from the Tomastra site to regain some of his private bubble, while being careful not to step onto the rails in the middle of the tunnel, although we should probably get out of here before that changes. Conglorge made an agreeing sound and also emerged from the maintenance shaft. It was quite the sight, seeing his enormous form seemingly manifest out of nowhere, as his dark blue plates were slowly illuminated by the faint light and separated from the darkness. Looking up at the reptile twice his size, he really wondered how he ever managed to just fight him without worries. Alcohol really was one hell of a drug.
"So, where are we?"
the giant asked, while his long tail cut through the air like a whip as it swung left to right. "Administration," James replied, and blinked with one hand covering his eyes in order to slowly get used to the light again. The giant let out an amused bellow.
"Isn't that exactly where she wants you to go?"
the little asked, lowering his head all the way down to James's level. so that he could directly look at him with two of his fiery eyes. James lifted his arm and softly knocked against one of the thick plates covering the Tonastrocyte's neck with the back of his right hand. "You bet it is," he replied, turning his hand around and putting his palm flat on the plate. "But it's also the only place where I can try to gain an advantage, so it's where I need to be. I told you to stop following me, remember?" Konglorsh let out a loud breath, and James could feel the rigid plate shift beneath his hands as the air left his airways. "You're wasting time," the giant mockingly said, and lifted his head up to his full height again, towering over James. "Lead the way, dancer." James shook his head, but he wasn't going to argue the point. He couldn't force anyone to save their own skin. With quick steps, the unlikely pair made their way over towards the nearby station, stepping over the red line supposed to keep possible passengers at a safe distance from the speeding trains into the open room. The Tonastrocyte paused for a moment, looking up at the truly colossal door separating them from the station's main floor. James walked up next to him, inspecting one of the number pads on the wall. "Once this thing opens, we've got to be quick," he clarified, while hovering his hand above the pad. "They don't have security guarding these doors, but that massive thing opening is sure to attract some attention, so the sooner we're away from it, the better." "Understood," Konglorsh replied, his massive maulers scratching across the floor eagerly while his tail whipped through the air again. James took a deep breath and entered the code. The sound as the truly gigantic gate shifted and was moved out of place by the enormous forces provided by what must have been hydraulics was eerily silent compared to the characteristic noise that smaller doors used by the community tended to make. However, neither of them could focus on that now, as they kept their head low, at least as low as the giant lizardor could keep his, and hurried out of the hidden station, quickly disappearing into the crowd of officials and civil servants. Once they had gained some distance to the people ogling the giant doorway, James pulled out his phone again, quickly glancing at the screen every few steps to try and orient himself with the help of a station map. None of the buildings, offices or authorities nearby were exceedingly interesting, mostly being connected to economy or construction and the likes. James was aiming for something a bit higher up in the food chain, all the way up if he had to. He would deal with the consequences later. When stuck behind enemy lines, it was about either remaining undetected or establishing some sort of advantage. He couldn't exactly pretend like he wasn't on the station, and surely the matriarch wouldn't tolerate him trying to stall for very long, no matter if he found a spot where she couldn't reach him, so he could only remain reasonably subtle while trying to find some sort of leverage. Or maybe, if he was exceedingly lucky, he may even find a way off the station by some strange miracle. Unlikely as it was, it never exactly hurt to hope. Speaking of which, he had completely neglected to ask. "Say, Konglorsh, you wouldn't happen to know a way off the station, would you?" he inquired casually, bringing it up like it was a normal everyday conversation he was having with his buddy. "I'm afraid you're out of luck, dancer," Konglorsh replied, picking up on the casual tone of the conversation surprisingly quickly. And as intended, the busy people of the station's administration hurriedly buzzed around and past them, not paying them or their talk any mind. "Since I've been stuck here, my crew has already flown out and is getting ready to reconvene at our usual meet-up point. My ship may still be in the hangar, but I doubt that we'll be let onto a shuttle in our current situation, and even if we did, without at least a minimal crew, the ship is nothing but an empty husk." James took his eyes off his phone screens and looked up at the many-eyed face. That was a lot more than he had expected. Wait, he said with a headshake, and raised an arm as if to indicate to stop. "Did you say your ship? And your crew?" Now that he thought about it, all of that had sounded mighty elaborate, with splitting up and reconvening at a previously established meetup point. Almost like it would be better not to ask too many questions. James felt the corner of his mouth creeping upwards as he slightly changed the topic before Konglorsh could answer his first inquiry. "So, what exactly did you say you needed for a minimal crew?" Konglorsh seemed to pick up on the idea slowly forming in James's mind. Without elaborating on his crew or his ship any further for the moment, he instead answered to James's second question. "I'm talking the barest of bare bones here, but operating the ship without at least a capable co-pilot and a mechanic on board is bordering on suicide." Well, he didn't know about capable exactly, and Curie usually worked on drones, not ships, but technically they had both of those, so that did shift things. Now there was only the question of getting access to the dock somehow. He peeked down at his phone screen and scanned the map again. Now where exactly were those pesky airlocks being controlled from? If he actually managed to get off the station, Maybe the riskier side of his plans could be avoided, and he could hand all of this off to someone who cared for such things. Although maybe he shouldn't completely disregard his first ideas, just in case. It was always good to have a plan B. Although which plan was A and which was B was a bit muddy at this point. Also, calling them plans was maybe overstating it a bit for now. As confident he felt while having pushed himself with the techniques drilled into him during his military training, he was still pretty much winging it. Then again, winging it had also been part of the training. He absolutely hated how much he had to rely on that dark chapter of his life right now, but he also had to admit to himself that there was absolutely no point in denying that fact right now. He could just be mad about it later. Finally, his eyes landed on something interesting that did ring a bell. Ooh, Central Department for Environmental Regulation, Subdivision, Control of Elemental Living Conditions, Subsection for Supervision of the Gravitational Spin. That one sounds important, he pondered out loud, while already planning the best route towards his new destination. Of all the things to use as leverage, gravity was one of the better choices, seeing as he could theoretically increase it by deadly amounts without any ill effects to himself, which was something that couldn't be said about other parts of life support. Now, just to hope that the matriarch most likely calling his bluff wouldn't be enough to take pressure off of her. Even as the leader supreme, a serious threat shouldn't be something that she can just disregard on her own. At least James hoped that was the case. You are aware that a place like that is surely equipped to deal with all kinds of terrorist attacks, aren't you? Conglorge interrupted his wishful thinking with a cold serving of reality from above. That he did. I'm working on it, James replied, with a finger to his temple. There was indeed an idea brewing up within him. Use the tools available to you. You're already doing the whole military shtick, so you can't sink much lower. They want a politician? Give them one, he thought to himself. Also, there was still a little toy that he hadn't gotten to use quite yet. That could probably come in handy.
I know that this is hard for you, but is this really necessary?
Captain Uton asked awkwardly, while slowly skulking alongside Shida on all fours, glancing at her every few steps with an uncomfortable look on his face. Shida slightly tilted her head towards him to make sure he knew she was giving him an annoyed look as an answer, even though all he could see in the tinted glass of her face mask was the warped reflection of his own face. It belonged to James. She had gotten it out of her in James's room earlier, along with the sword that now adorned her hip, and also belonged to James. After reading the instructions sent to her by the Captain Superior, she had called in one of the Rushgak workers and disappeared into the room along with them for a long time, before emerging wearing her uniform instead of her casual clothing and carrying James's items. She had taken a noticeably long time just to get changed and fetch 2 items. However, once she had returned, she immediately told the captain that they should get going, and despite Curious protest, they were taken along with them. James had said that they should not leave the embassy until he said otherwise. However, Shida had said that James's word didn't have meaning anymore, and that Curie would have to come along. And she made it very clear that no would not be an acceptable answer. Usually, running through the events in their mind one more time helped Curie bring order to their mind. However, right now they just couldn't figure it out. They didn't quite know what to believe when it came to Shida's behaviour. There was just too much they didn't know. Curie decided that, if there was a plan they didn't fully know about, it would be better not to jeopardise it by asking about it, like they had done back on board. It would probably be better if they didn't talk to the people involved at all for the time being. Yet that way, there was nothing to do but to think, as they were quietly being led across the walkways, snaking through the air in the middle of the station by Shida and the captain. The walkways were eerily empty, as if suddenly nobody on the station needed to go anywhere quickly anymore. The captain lifted a hand, as if he wanted to reach out for Shida. However, before he reached her, he pulled it back again. Then it seemed like he wanted to say something, however his mouth moved without sounds emerging from it, and he quickly closed it back up again. He looked around as if lost in thought. Finally, Shida let out an annoyed sound that was artificially enhanced by a microphone-speaker combination within the mask that was built to minimize its muffling effect. "If you have something to say it already," she said, in an entirely inappropriate tone for a petty officer talking to the captain. However, the captain seemed to have very different worries, as he slightly flinched at her distorted voice.
"Well,
the captain said. However, he suddenly stopped as if the words had gotten stuck in his throat, and he had to clear them out. After a few seconds of clearing his throat, the primate finally continued.
I'm just glad that everything's finally out in the open between us. I know I have to do it a lot, but I hate keeping secrets, especially from you."
It was hard gauging Sheeta's reaction with the mask she wore. However, her ears stood up straight, or turned outwards to listen to the captain, just to then suddenly turn forwards when the speaker once again came to life as her amplified voice answered. "Well, if we're doing this whole revealing secret stuff, you should know that I've slept with James. Like, actually this time." Her tone was very matter-of-fact, as if discussing the current weather. Curie wondered why Sheeta would care to let the captain in on such private details. However, the captain seemed to be appropriately uncomfortable with that sudden revelation, as his demeanour turned even more incommodious than it had been.
"Well, I figured it would come to this,"
he mumbled, while avoiding looking at Sheeta.
"I just hoped it wouldn't have to be so soon. I hoped this wouldn't be any harder for you than it had to be."
Sheeta smacked her lips, as she tended to do when wordlessly dismissing somebody, while her tail pointed straight into the air. "I'm just looking out for myself. James knows me, so he will know that too, and he will see reason," she said unsympathetically, and put her hands behind her head while walking. "And if he doesn't, he isn't worth the trouble. I've worked too hard to keep somebody around me who's only making problems. I've left that kind of life behind on Dumnia." The captain's face softened a bit, as he finally reached out to Sheeta, putting his large hand on her back.
"That you did, and I couldn't be more proud,"
he gently said, and weakly patted her. The ear that was oriented towards him slightly twitched, and Sheeta reached out to the captain's arm, meekly grabbing a handful of fur and holding onto it. "I know," she said briefly, her voice trailing off as she spoke. Then she let go of the captain and started to walk with more vigour in her step than before. "I just hope the matriarch delivers. If I go through all of this trouble just to be left to starve in the end, you'll have quite a bit to answer for," she said, with clear distrust in her voice. The captain hurried to catch up to the suddenly accelerating Sheeta and quickly reassured her.
"Once you have proven yourself, you will be a prime example for all that can be achieved. I mean, just look at you, laying off all your preconceived notions and acting for the benefit of a united community, despite the stones put in your way. Things like this must be rewarded, otherwise who would follow your example? Apogeonora knows that too."
On that, Sheeta seemed to be pondering for a moment. As to Curie, like a reinforcement learning algorithm, changes towards the ideal would be rewarded, and paths, or in this case individuals, nearing the ideal would be favoured. Observed purely logically, it didn't sound like a bad approach to bringing change to a society. However, Curie couldn't help but think that there were some variables that were missing in that assessment, which could possibly complicate the result. Variables like changes towards the ideal in this proposed algorithm being detrimental in another one, with the rewards provided by one algorithm having to be offset with the penalisation from another perceived one. Penalisations like, for example, being stuck in a very disagreeable situation with what would usually be an easy way out, would it not mean moving away from the perceived ideal proposed by the algorithm? Such a conflict of interest would sooner or later force individuals to choose between the proposed ideal and the perceived ideal, leading to a subset of individuals for which the penalisations of the perceived algorithm would outweigh the rewards of the proposed algorithm, causing a shift away from the wanted ideal, despite the unfavourable position this would lead to. Curie felt a strange feeling course through their nervous system at that thought, a tingling slowly creeping through their body and ending in the very tips of their backwards legs. Of course, in a way, this was true for every interaction within a societal setting. However, usually this was a passive process provided by the general public. If there was, however, an active force trying to drive this process forward in a predetermined direction, it could mean an accelerated progression of events, causing a possible problem with delayed adaptations of factors outside of the group's control. "Well, if you want people to change, then what about them?" Sheeta suddenly said, turning her masked head to indicate towards Curie, involving them in the conversation for the first time since they had left the hive complex. "It's pretty hard to change if you get blown to bits, dissolved and finally burned away to nothing." The captain looked over his shoulder, and for a second, Curie's gaze met his, before he quickly tore his eyes away and stiffly stared straight forward instead. He had to clear his throat again before he could answer. It was like things kept clogging up his vocal cords every time he wanted to speak.
"While I am a proponent of change as well as second and even third chances, some people are just too far gone,"
he dejectedly stated, while keeping his eyes on the way before them.
"And I fear that some changes are quite irreversible. Personally, my philosophy is to just let them live out the rest of their days and focus on those that can still be guided, to shape the future rather than get stuck in the now. However, it seems that the future has become a point of anxiety for some, and they would much rather take routes that have more immediate effects."
Sheeta could be heard snorting. Some of the tattered toothless are getting worried that they won't see things come about during their lifetime, I bet, she mockingly barked, and her tail started to sway around wildly.
Some of them have waited very long for an opportunity to present itself, the captain replied almost apologetically, although a hint of agreement was audible in his voice. They were patient as long as they had just hoped, but now that they feel it within their reach, they can hardly hold themselves anymore.
They had waited for an opportunity to present itself. They waited for a long time, and then something must have changed. Something to do with James, humanity. Something that, by all accounts, should have been almost as removed from the proposed ideal as Curie themselves, or Shida before her change of heart, was. Yet it was seen as an opportunity, so there must have been a variable yet unconsidered. Curie's mind buzzed as they tried to keep themselves occupied while being led along. They would rather not think about their current situation, so figuring out everything else seemed to be the preferable course of action. There wasn't much they could do now, and maybe this could help them in the future. Pretty pathetic if you ask me, Shida commented disdainfully, but quickly dropped the topic, instead bringing it back to the task at hand. But anyway, what's the plan for them now? So far everything's been royally screwed up after all. The captain took a few deep breaths and made some contemplative sounds, as his tail now also uncoiled and started moving erratically.
I'm not sure their situation has changed all that much, he finally admitted, awkwardly pulling at the hairs on his neck with one arm. I'm sorry, I know you two are close.
Shida let out a sharp laugh that clearly peaked the audio of the microphone in the mask, causing the sound to crackle and distort even more than usual. Never mind about me, she said with a sarcastic tone in her voice. It's not like I'm overly attached. However, I thought that you still wanted to get James on your side. If you so much as scratch that metal body of theirs, you can throw that idea right at the airlock. Her words stung. Curie couldn't describe it any other way, but despite them and Shida rarely finding common ground, they stung. In fact, this whole situation stung like 1,000 needles all throughout their body. The captain seemed to consider Shida's words for a moment, scratching his chin and looking contemplative. However, as soon as he leaned in closer towards her and suggestively said, "Well, I think we may know somebody who we might be willing to reconsider for." However, he was quickly interrupted by Shida raising her hand right in his face, cutting him off. "Nah, forget it," she quickly clarified, putting a lot of emphasis on her words by pushing her hand even more into the captain's face. "I may already be no more than yesterday's bones to him just for working with you, but if I touch Curie, I'll be so out, I might as well be last year's weather report, so don't get good ideas." The captain looked outraged, scratching up his face and looking wide-eyed, although it didn't quite seem like his shock was directed at Shida.
"Aren't you more important to him than that?"
he said indignantly, gesticulating with his right hand and clenching it into a fist. But Shida just calmly shook her head. "I won't be if I harm his pack," she explained stonily. "If you want to convince him, Curie's well-being is indispensable. If you haven't understood that yet, I'm afraid this whole operation is doomed to fail." Somehow things stung a bit less now, but it was also worrying. Shida and James had a strange understanding of each other, so if Shida said James would let no harm come to Curie, that was most likely true. However, something Curie knew James to be much less averse to was letting harm come to himself, and Curie really hoped that the first fact would not be the cause of the second one somehow. James seemed to already be in harm's way more than enough. It would be unfair for him to also step before Curie. Then again, in the way that was what he had been doing since the start.
"You may be right," the captain said,
having considerably deflated from his previous outburst. "I am right," Shida said with emphasis, lifting a single-clawed finger warningly. "You better tell your matriarch that the way she's been running things won't work, since I doubt she'll listen to me. Maybe I can get James to listen, but that won't be possible if everyone else keeps pushing him." With that, she aggressively turned forward again, taking big strides in the direction of their destination, and mumbling under her breath, "This all better be worth it." "Ah, welcome. How can I help you today?" "Oh, is that so? Well, excuse me, but why, of course. There we go. Oh, yes, it is an honor to greet you here, Ambassador. We're always glad to welcome the representatives of our worlds. If I may ask, who is accompanying you today?" "Ah, very well. In that case, if you will please follow me, I'm sure you'll see that everything is up to the highest of standards. We are on the most important station after all. All of our workers are highly skilled experts, and, of course, our security is..." Reprieve stood some distance away from the gathering assembly of shipmen and officers called in from the GES-32, most of which were bickering with each other about being called in while on the station, and the possible reasons for that. However, more eyes on the lookout for the freak who knew what to look for would certainly be helpful, However, the station was also massive, and covering its entire area would be nigh impossible, even if they had 100 times the manpower. If James had managed to avoid them thus far, chances were that he wouldn't be found unless he wanted to be. Reprieve's thoughts were disturbed by the very annoyed sounds that Skye kept making just outside of his vision, while she constantly rummaged through her many bags and satchels. "Could have sworn I paired 3 of them this morning," the lowlife finally murmured to herself, while uselessly shaking one of the bags, as if that would change anything about his content. Then she finally gave it up and raised her eyes, following Reprieve's gaze all the way to the gathering crowd. "And what's with them?" Reprieve took a deep breath through his trunk before answering. "They're waiting for the captain. So far their task is only to gather in the station's command area, so they're awaiting further orders for now," he explained dismissively, without looking over towards her. "And since this is a rather precarious situation, it's best if the captain himself is the one doing the ordering." To the outsider, it must have looked like some military drill was going on, with the sheer amount of personnel suddenly assembling and the area being clear for them. "Sounds like a waste of time if you ask me," the girl indignantly blurted out. Oh, just what had he done to deserve this? Of course he had to get stuck with the lowlife while Haiferty and Tessil were mingling with the crowd. He could see them scurrying about and trying to calm people. Why couldn't Haifer watch the urchin? She was so fond of her after all. Of course he knew that it was only logical that those two would help with planning, since their job, or at least their perceived job, on board, had been in the administration, but that didn't mean he had to like it. Now just where was the captain? Given the officers being activated, it was clear that the whole idea of talking sense into James had worked about as well as Reprieve had expected. So, what was keeping him so long? And there was also another thing. "What were you looking for so frantically anyway?" Reprieve asked, to steer his train of thought away from things he had no influence over. "Oh, nothing," Skye quickly replied, and lifted her arms in a dismissive gesture. "Must have just misanswered, or misremembered, one of the two." Short but pointless. He was starting to notice a trend in his conversations with the rogue. Shuffling her hoof feet while watching the busy happenings before her, Skye hesitantly spoke up again. "So, this is quite a bit of effort just to pin one guy. Where do you think this will all lead?" Reprieve combed through the fur in his head with his hand before he answered. He had wondered that himself by now. Somehow it felt like they were slowly gliding down a slippery slope, one that wouldn't end well for anybody. "I can't tell," he admitted honestly, feeling his tic manifesting as he started to compulsively lick his trunk. "But I have a feeling we won't have to wait too long to find out. The freak isn't really known to stay quiet for long." A moment of silence followed, and for that moment Reprieve thought that the rogue may actually be thinking through their current situation. However, it soon became clear that there was just something else that had captured her attention. "Would you look at that? A regular old menagerie is approaching," she said, while looking off into the distance. Reprieve followed her gaze irritated, wondering what could be so interesting. However, his snappy comment died in his throat as he saw who was approaching. The captain slowly trotted along, with the monster and the abomination by his side, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Although the monster had for some reason covered her face with a reflective mask, her uniform and ears clearly gave her away. More importantly, what was the captain thinking? Was he daft? Had he completely forgotten what they were doing here, bringing those two along? Even worse was that he seemed to be ignoring the group of officers for the moment, instead beelining it straight towards where Reprieve and Skye were standing. Reprieve had just about enough awareness to stand at attention as Uton was approaching, with Skye looking at him confusedly. "That is Reprieve," the captain immediately uttered, once he had come into earshot, and calmingly waved one of his big hands around. "Please, this isn't the time for formalities." Reprieve did as he was told, relaxing his pose and looking back at the much larger man, although his eyes kept being pulled towards his unsightly companions. "Sir, forgive me, but I have to ask, what are those two doing with you?" he asked directly, trying to keep the distaste in his voice to a minimum. "Happy to see you too, Reprieve," the strangely morphed voice of the monster answered from underneath her mask. However, the captain just shook his big head and already started to turn on the spot. "I don't have time. I have to go and organize the search. Shada will explain everything to you. For the moment, the two of you will have to look after Curie," he said, hesitating a bit before calling the abomination by their nickname. Then, before Reprieve could get a word in sideways, the captain was already gone, loudly addressing his officers waiting for him. And before he could have any second thoughts, Reprieve inadvertently found himself locked in a one-sided staring contest with the blank mask of the Miat. "Surprised to see me?" she asked, clearly mocking him and letting her tail swing around in wide sways. Reprieve swallowed. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't," he admitted with a distrustful look. "How come you're not in restraints?" The monster merely sniggered at his poorly veiled insult. "Well, it'd be hard to keep watch over Curie while in cuffs, don't you think?" she sarcastically asked, and made a wide gesture with her arms, as if to show off her very much unrestrained range of motion. "Wait, am I missing something here?" Sky suddenly chimed in, stepping up to the conversation and curiously eyeing the new arrivals. Sheeta's mask slightly tilted, as she was apparently giving the rogue a once-over. "So, you must be Sky then. James told me about you, but I've only seen you on camera so far," she finally concluded, and playfully wiggled her ears in place. A gesture that Sky seemingly subconsciously repeated back to her. "Don't go off topic," Reprieve sternly demanded, and stepped between the two Deathworld women to break their line of sight. "Just what is going on? What are you doing here acting all buddy-buddy all of a sudden?" The monster smacked her lips in annoyance. "You're fun as always," she said peeved, and shook her masked head. "But you can relax, we're on the same side now." Reprieve narrowed his eyes at her suspiciously. "How come?" he said warily, fixating the woman with his gaze. The monster groaned, as if it was a great bother to have to answer him. "I know what's best for myself," she finally replied, raising her arms to an implied shrug. "And your bosses have made me an offer that's hard to refuse. I worked all my life to get where I am. I can't just throw it away now. And things are much the same for James, he just hasn't realized it yet." So, the monster was thinking of herself. Go figure. At least some things were still making sense around here, although her sudden shift of allegiance still seemed quite suspicious to Reprieve. "And you plan on making him see that?" Reprieve asked more candidly this time, raising his trunk towards the feline. "If I can," she replied, breaking the suggested eye contact and looking over to where the captain was, in the process of organising the search. "If possible, I would still like to avoid getting on James's bad side." Well, they had that much in common. During the entire conversation, the abomination stood there motionless, just observing them with their cold, unnatural eyes, and showing no signs of even being alive. Reprieve first stood up inadvertently, but the monster seemed to not even pay the unnatural thing any mind. And Sky was even worse, creeping ever closer to the cyborg, presumably to get a better look at them. He tore his eyes away from the strange display, instead focusing on the task ahead. Somehow the freak would have to see reason, or they would have to make him. Although, while disposing of him may have been risky, it also wasn't entirely out of the question. Of course, for anything to happen, either they would have to find the freak, or he would have to make his move. After what had felt like ages, and actually had most likely been at least an hour, finally James's phone buzzed back to life. Quickly he excused himself from the group for a moment to take the call. "Aldwin," he answered the phone in a practiced manner.
"James, I'm sorry for the wait, but you know the station doesn't lead itself."
The overly enthusiastic voice of the matriarch came out of his speakers.
"But I'm more than happy to give you some more of my time now. Now, where have we left off?"
James took a deep breath. "Actually, I have a question first, and please, be honest with me," he said, indecently, and looked over to the group of people distractedly observing him.
"Of course, ask away,"
the matriarch answered, in that oh-so-sickly sweet tone of hers. "Have you decided to eliminate me yet, or are you still trying to get me on your side?" he asked, in a deliberately casual manner, not letting on that the thought of possibly being targeted for assassination even so much as bothered him. A loud trumpeting snort could be heard from the speaker.
"Oh, please, James, we're no monsters,"
Madame Tour finally answered, mirroring his conversational tone, as if they were discussing the matter over a cup of tea.
"We would still very much like to welcome you among our ranks. Let bygones be bygones and all that."
James couldn't help but snigger slightly. "Well, in that case, would you be so kind as to let your security know not to shoot me?" he responded amusedly, and started to stretch and rotate his shoulders, loosening up his limbs. "I'm quite tough, but we both know I'm not immortal. It would be a shame if some trigger-happy security guard did anything that we would both regret, wouldn't it?"
"Wait, James, what are you—"
Click. That was the last thing he could hear, as he leisurely hung up the call and strolled back over towards his guide, their guards, and an eagerly awaiting sight. "Sorry for the wait," he excused himself to the guide, who looked at him with a well-practiced business smile. "I had to work out some diplomatic issues really quick."